Hey, welcome to Conversations in the Round. I'm here with Chris Kelly, Adam Heath, Justin Bradshaw, and here we're going to do something a little bit different this week because a lot of you are going through the Rooted study. Are you guys laughing because I'm yelling already? Or is there other reasons you're laughing at me? Okay. We're going to do something a little bit different this week and front load a little bit of a sermonette, for lack of a better way to put it, so that those of you that are preparing for the Rooted study, which this week is chapter 8 with regard to money, you can kind of capture the content of this thing and move on with your preparation and come back to the conversation if you so choose later. So I'm going to kind of work through some content here, maybe 10, 12 minutes. Could go a little bit longer if these guys feel like chiming in, which I've invited them to do for sure as I go through this. We'll take a little break, which will be nothing for you, but we'll just stop for a second and then we'll re-engage and we'll get back into conversation altogether. Okay, so this week we're talking about money, which is a difficult subject to do in church. In fact, if I talked about money as much as Jesus did, we wouldn't have much of a church because it would be way too much for most people's liking, that's for sure. But he talked about it a lot. And here's the reason. Money has the capacity to steal our attention away from God. I think it's safe to say more than any other thing on earth. And Jesus said straight up, you can't serve two, what does he call it? Two masters. And he uses himself. It's like God, you can't serve God and mammon, which is, I don't know, it's almost like a mythological character that represents money. So you can't serve God and money. And he brings that up because it is a tremendous threat for the human race to serve money. I want to start by answering this question. Why is it such a threat? Why is it such a challenge for us to substitute money in for God? You've probably heard this statement, money isn't the root of all evil. The love of money is at the root of all evil. But what does that mean? What does it mean that the love of money is at the root of all evil? If you love money, what do you love? You got to answer that question. And it's kind of philosophical, so hang with me a little bit here. Like, what is money? Here's a standard definition of what money is. It's a token. It's a representation. It's a thing that functions as a socially, legally accepted medium of exchange in payment for goods and services or in settlement of debt, right? So money is just a thing that serves as a go-between, an in-between, an intermediary tool that allows us to avoid, just straight up bartering or trading. Now, that's what you used to do when there was no medium. I had something you needed, you had something I needed, and we tried to find some way of equating the value of those things, and we would trade. Now we have an intermediary tool, it's called money. Money has value then in an economy, in a particular economy, and it can be exchanged for other things. Are you still with me? This is the basic use of money, right? I want that, so I give you this amount, there's a price, and you give it to me, right? So here's the thing though. Therefore, within a particular economy, if you have money, by association, you have value, right? You have value, or you could go as far as to say you have significance. You have the capacity to engage that economy. It's not like unlike a game of Monopoly. You can't be in the game if you don't have any money. And if you run out of money, you're out of the game. But if you have money, you have the capacity to not just be in the game, but to be a vibrant part of the game. And you can win the game. You can't do that without money. Life is that way. Money gives us a sense of value. That value is not only personal, but it's practical. Having money is also the ability or the power to acquire what you need or what you want. So money gives you value. It also gives you power. So in a manner of speaking, you can say this. This is why is money such a threat? To steal our devotion from God. Because money gives a person value and power. I don't know if you ever thought about that. Having money makes you feel significant, and it makes you feel like you can control your life, right? Yeah. If you sit down and think about this, you can actually look in the spaces of life where you've used money to be significant, or to appear significant, or to seem valuable. And you've used money to control your life, to make it easier, to make work easier, to make home life easier, to give yourself more time, right? This is what we use it for, and it feels great. You can begin to realize then when you think about how money gives you value or power, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. How am I doing on time, guys? Is this?
6 minutes.
6 minutes, okay. Recognizing money as a societal means for acquiring value and power within a particular economy begins to explain the holistic crushing of a person and the debilitating effect of poverty. Think about this. If money gives you value and power, the poor, those that are impoverished, those that are socioeconomically in the lower echelons, they don't just not have a way of exchanging for goods and services. In that society, in that system, they lack value and they lack power. So those that we might, that have wealth or have money, we tend to judge a person who's hungry, but they have a pair of tennis shoes that are associated with somebody popular or rich. Or they're going hungry, but they have a cell phone so that they can use an app or a social media platform to use their voice and feel powerful. We look down our nose on the impoverished when they do things that gain them value and power, because that's what's lacking most when you don't have it. The reason that money is a threat to our devotion to God is because it is in many ways, an easy way to have power and value. So if we recognize that money is the means for value and power within a society and economy, it's the first step to understanding why loving money is antithetical to loving God. That a passionate pursuit of money prohibits a passionate pursuit of God. Because we know this, even really at the most rudimentary understanding of God, we know that our value is supposed to solely come from Him. And that we're not to consolidate and or exercise power in human relationships, but we're supposed to follow Jesus' example and lay down our power and trust instead in the power of God. So when we're looking to money for value and power, we are not looking to God. Any thoughts thus far? I'm going to read a couple verses and then wrap it up, but anything?
You've in a really short amount of time, you've touched on a lot of big concepts in relation to money. And we'll get into those things in a bit, kind of unpacking what is money.
That's great. That's great. So you're set. Chris is facilitating the discussion when we come back. And so I'm glad to hear that. That's what we want to do. We want to scratch the surface of the primary things with this little sermonette and then uncover it all later and dig it out. Anything from you, Adam, yet at this point?
Well, maybe nothing that I wouldn't also use later in the conversation, but
okay, yeah.
I think that the way you're setting it up about identity is
right.
Is striking at the heart of maybe some of the challenges I've faced personally. And I think in a sense, globally, you could say like, yeah, this is just a matter of allegiance. Mm-hmm. Where does your allegiance lie?
Mm-hmm.
And
Good.
the temptation is to allow your allegiance to stray away from Jesus to something lesser, but more immediate, more tactile.
Yeah.
And money is maybe chief among those things.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think the love of money can sometimes feel elusive, but when we love our value and our power that we have, we're like, oh, that's not a love of money. But
Yeah.
it's a little bit more tangible to see, oh, I'm not quite as well off spiritually
Right.
as I think I am.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I appreciate that. I wanted to emphasize that point that you pulled out right there, that when I ask this question, why do we love money? And what does it mean that we love money? It's really that we love value and we love power. That's what we love. We don't really love. So when to say loving money is the root of it, I would say, no, loving value and power is at the root of all evil. If you want to define evil as, not pursuing God.
Right.
That's the sum total of it. So listen to a couple verses. In Matthew chapter 6, kind of the middle section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says this: "So when you give to the needy, don't announce it with trumpets like hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done will reward you." There's a lot of conversation there about value, right? And he's saying, hey, look, when you're giving to the needy, don't make a big deal out of it, because what are you doing when you're making a big deal out of your giving? You're saying, look how significant I am, look at how valuable I am, and look at how powerful I am. and you get, like I said, don't let the left hand see what the right hand is doing. This is what I always imagine in my mind, is that somebody's giving away money really kind of exorbitantly with their right hand, and then the left hand, some really important person's giving them a high five. That's what's happening. They're being rewarded for what they're doing. And God's saying, look, that's not the way to go about it. And he's just very clearly demonstrating how we use money to get significance, to get value, to get control. A little bit later in that same chapter 6 in Matthew, he says, "Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where they don't destroy and where thieves do not break and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be." Our devotion is always going to be tied up with what we treasure. And when we treasure the value and the purpose and the significance and the control and the power that this world gives us, that's where our heart will be. That's where our devotion will be. That's where our allegiances will be, to use Adam's word, right? And this starts to explain why Jesus says greed is so deadly. Because at its core, greed isn't just a lust for money, it's a lust for value and power apart from God. And that's my last point, and try to wrap this up. Greed is uniquely dangerous. In the middle of chapter 6, this is what we read. Between those two examples of the hypocrite giving his money in an exorbitant way, or storing up the wrong treasures. It says this: "The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. If your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" This is a hard verse to understand, and it doesn't even make sense that it's at its face why it's in the middle of all this stuff about money. This is what that means. If a room is full of light, your body can move about in that room and not trip over things and bang into things, and it can see what's in that room. If your eyes aren't working, then no matter how much light is in that room, you're in the dark. If you can't see, then you are completely in the dark and you don't know how to navigate life or do whatever. And Jesus ties this same use of the word light and eyes together with greed in Luke 11 and 12. He says, look, this is about this. And here's the thing. This is the thing I want you to hear about this. In addition to the fact that we really lust for value and power, is to realize what Jesus is saying here is that materialism, money, possessions, greed, they have a blinding effect. It may be one of the most dangerous of the 7 deadly sins because we don't see it. We are blind to our greed. I've been a pastor for 25 years. I've used this illustration before. I've sat with people, friends, co-pastors, congregants, whatever. We've sat and we've talked about how sin impacts our life. We talk about purity, and we talk about all sorts of different ways that we sin. Nobody has ever come into my office and said, Pastor, I've got a problem. I want too much. I'm greedy. No one does that. That's the nature of greed. That's the nature of greed. If you're sitting here thinking, or you're listening, or you're doing the study in Rooted, and you're thinking to yourself, I don't really have a problem with greed, you're in big trouble. That's the nature of greed, is that we have fallen asleep on it. All you got to do is look at your work, look at your job, look at why you take certain jobs, look at why you don't speak up when your company or your business is unethical or doing the disservice to your own city. Look at your own lifestyle, why you bought this, why you bought that. No one ever wants to sit down and look at their whole budget and figure out who's at the center of most of that spending. No one wants to do it. We don't even ask the questions. Greed and money issues just make us, we're just blind to it. So Jesus finishes with this: no one can serve two masters. Either you're going to hate the one or love the other. You'll be devoted to one or despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. In summary, this is what we're saying. We really, really long for value and purpose and significance and power, and money is an easy way to get that. And what makes this super dangerous is that we are greedy, we do lust for those things, and we don't know it, which means what? We are actually insidiously devoted not to God. There is a serious, serious threat to our spirituality, to our Christianity, to our relationship with God that money does, and we, by and large, don't know it. So we got to dig into it. That's what we're going to do. So we're going to take a little break. We'll be right back, and we'll get a conversation going. All right, welcome back. We're going to engage the conversation now. Thanks for rejoining us if you stepped away. Talking about money, I'm turning it over to Chris. He's going to facilitate discussion. Let's do it.
All right. So I'm going to start differently than I'd originally thought, because I hope you were paying close attention to what Pastor Mike was saying. He touched on a lot of very deep and profound things that maybe through the course of our lives we don't, like you were saying, we don't stop to think about it.
Yeah.
But I think what would be good for us to do is to further unpack what is mammon.
Okay.
And to maybe even reframe how we describe what mammon is. And the reason that I think it's probably good to do that, and you used a word towards the end of your message, insidious. Mm-hmm. Some other words that came to mind is like the combination of things that are both subtle and nefarious, if I could use an equally cool word. And that really is the nature of mammon in the course of our lives. And what's really interesting about Scripture is when God is paying so much attention to something, that's a cue for us to take note of that, right? Mm-hmm. And then to further personify something that is otherwise just a thing, like it's inanimate, right? We were talking about money, mm-hmm. and it has no personality, no mind, right. No heartbeat, and yet it's personified in Scripture.
Yeah.
And this concept of mammon that's unpacked further. So it's not just about money. Mm-hmm. And you said that all of us are engaged with this tension. Mm-hmm. All of us have some space in our lives where we're blind to the effects and maybe the struggle between belief and disbelief between God and this, let's say, false God, mammon, if we could frame it that way.
Yeah, so much of our lives are, at the core of our life is identity. Mm-hmm. At the core of our life is identity, and we're built to get our identity from God. So there's this setup where we get our identity from, I don't know what you call it, like a greater being or a greater purpose.
Yeah, we make something ultimate. Yeah.
We're going to make something mm-hmm. ultimate, and we're relational, so it's going to be a relational thing. And our identity comes from what makes us feel valuable and powerful, like we said. And so it is personal. It's personal. We're going to look to not money, but the king of money, or a personification of the king of money, which I would say is mammon. That would be how I would describe it.
Yeah, personification is kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, because I think you could actually expand that, get a wider angle and start to think like, oh, isn't that the human tendency with all things? You think about like the Greek gods and goddesses, and you think like, okay, here we personified wisdom, and we said like, okay, Athena, she's got that.
Yeah.
And there's this tendency for some people to say, I'm worshiping that. I want everyone to think I have what it takes intellectually. Mm-hmm. They worship Athena. Or you look at Bacchus and Dionysus, the Roman and Greek version of the god of wine. It's like, well, do you know anybody who maybe is worshiping wine? Like, this is my salvation tonight. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I got some weight I'm carrying around with me tonight. This is going to save me. And we personify all kinds of things. You just think through the Greek gods and goddesses, and we think, oh yeah, those are just things that people made ultimate, and they gave them a name. So mammon makes perfect sense in that context, that this is something that people make ultimate. Maybe it's the most likely thing for someone to make ultimate, and it has a name.
Yeah, I think, the origins of the word mammon aren't really solidly known, and so it often gets translated as wealth or money, and that's totally acceptable. Another layer to that is one of the origins of the word means from acquisition. And so if you think about serving two masters, and one of them being God, who's the provider of all things, but the other one is trying to acquire everything. That's you can't have both, right? And that's the point. You can't have both. You can't be serving both, because either you have to acquire everything because you need to take care of yourself and provide for yourself, or you trust God to provide for you. Everything.
Yeah, and that has echoes of the original lie, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you think about what the serpent is whispering into the ears of Adam and Eve, it's, you can have the things of God without God. You can be God. You can have all the attributes of God and provide for yourself.
Yes.
And maybe a subtle twist to it is, God really doesn't want what's ultimately good for you anyway.
Yeah.
He's not going to take care of you. You're going to have to take care of yourself. Yeah. I think that fits in with what you're saying about mammon right there.
I think it's even helpful to personify the God of money. Like, I don't know, it's humanly helpful for me to think, okay, I'm making a decision about the kind of car I'm going to buy, or the size of house I'm going to buy, or how much I'm going to spend on a pair of jeans. And I know this sounds weird, but it's like, I'm going to pray about those things. God's given me the resources that I have. They're his. I'm his steward. I'm going to use these in a certain way. And it's actually instructive for me to sit and think, praying to God about how to use it. And I'm also aware of this other king, this other mammon, who's saying to me, I'd spend just a little more on that. If you do that, if you go that way, you're going to sort of stack up a little bit better. To think about somebody actually trying to convince me to spend my money in an ungodly way is actually helpful for me in the process of decision making, because I think, I'm not listening to that guy. But that whole blindness thing makes it seem like I'm either following God or, I must be just following God, because there's no other. That's the part that's blind. You put a face and a personification to it that's trying to convince you to do otherwise. It kind of just highlights my decision making, really.
I think that's a really interesting way to frame it. There's so much about the Christian life, if I could describe it this way, that exists on a spectrum. There's some fuzziness about it. It's something that's kind of progressively unraveled through the course of your life. But this topic is so abrupt. God is so clear. You either serve me or you're serving everyone. You can't have fuzzy. That's how important this topic is. And you mentioned identity. God, we know that God is uniquely the only person that is in a position to declare over us who we are. He's our creator. He's the one who knit us together in the wombs of our mothers and wrote the story of our lives and all those things. And so he's declaring to us, this is your identity. This is what's true. And so it's interesting if you have this personified false God, just like the lie of the garden, what God says is not true. And it's about your heart. You talked a lot about the heart. Your heart isn't this, your heart is that. And that's the voice of mammon, right? And that's why it's so dangerous. During the course of my life, it was really helpful to actually begin to sort through, okay, here's something I think is true, and I'm realizing that here's something I thought was true, but it's actually a lie. And everybody's struggling with these things. You even alluded to something, personal struggles in this space, and we're all in that space. So lest anybody think they're somehow above it, that blindness you referred to. If you were to categorize or name or list some of the lies that either you struggle with or you're aware of other people struggling with in relation to this false God, the false identity that this God is trying to declare of your life, what are some of those things? What are some of those lies?
And P.S., this would be a great thing for people who are watching to leave in the comment section as well.
Right.
Yeah, good one.
You mentioned dignity, self-worth, power, control, value, our position in society and culture, our options, choices. What's at the core of those things that people pursue? What are the lies? What's the root that leads to this behavioral fruit, if I could put it this way? I believe I have control because... Is that making sense, what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's value for me. I've joked, but it's not much of a joke, that one of my love languages is cash.
I appreciate that.
And it's because I think, look, if I'm doing a good job, I don't really want you to say, hey, you're doing a good job. I just want you to give me a raise, because in this society, the raise and the income is that's a lie. That means you're doing a good job. It actually does mean that. It actually does mean it's pretty rare that you get a raise when you're doing a bad job. So there is something really inside of our economy that says when I do a good job, which again goes on a whole nother rabbit trail to the beauty of the value we get from God not being performance-based. So the lie for me in that context is performance. Is my performance is where I get my value. I've stopped saying it now because I'm too far down the pike. But early in ministry, I thought all the time, oh man, I should have just went to the corporate world for 5 or 6 years and got some money and then done ministry. It's like, I could have, and I think I might have even, ministry doesn't necessarily give you, nor should it give you significance. And so there was even a part of me that thought, there were a lot of times where I think, man, I'd feel so much more significant if I'd have gone the corporate route. So for me, the lie is performance and significance, and it comes from the reward of money.
I think it could be even sort of like you talked about on that spectrum where we might dress it up a little bit and baptize it a little bit by saying, no, it's really just, I just want to know that God approves. And I think that's a really sure sign that he must approve if he's materially blessing me. And I think that's the paradigm you see God working against, and specifically Jesus in his ministry working against. He said, you can't associate your material, affluence with my approval. You can't. You can't look at the poor and say, oh, they must not have God's approval, and you can't look at the rich and say that they do. But I think we're sort of like these children looking for ways to say, does my daddy approve or not? And we might take shortcuts when we're little, and I think we still take shortcuts when we're adults. And then one of the shortcuts is to say, like, the money thing, that's my shortcut to knowing I have approval. Maybe it's all of these people's approval, but we might baptize and dress it up and say, it's ultimately God's approval of my life that he blessed me this way, materially.
Let me ask you this. What you just described, in my mind, is counter-gospel. It's not the gospel.
It's a lower G gospel, like Paul says in Galatians 1. That's right.
These guys didn't answer the question. I had to answer the question about lies in my life, and these guys just went theoretical.
Mike,
Come on
you don't
now.
need to perform.
Okay.
That's
pretty good.
Well, we'll come back to that. We'll make sure that you have your opportunities to answer things. I think Adam just stepped into a space that's extremely important. Some might call it the counterfeit gospel, the prosperity gospel.
Right.
Whether we want to admit it or not, we're all in that space to some extent or another. It's like if I'm receiving whatever it is I think that makes me feel safe or have options or security, whatever, then God must love me. He must affirm, he must accept, whatever. But if I fall on hard times, then woe is me. I'm wrong with God. To me, what you're saying is, if that's your mindset, you're forgetting the gospel.
Yeah.
And so, if someone were to bring that to you, if you were to experience that, if you were to hear that out of your own heart, how would you preach the gospel in that space? What would you say?
Well, I think you're right to recognize that there are lots of competing gospels, which Paul says very clearly in Galatians 1 aren't really gospels at all. They're not actually good news. And so the one maybe dealing with money is you might sort of have this series of thoughts where you say, like, my greatest problem is I don't have enough money. Maybe it starts very innocently to get my kids the education I want them to have, or the car that's going to keep my wife safe, or whatever. And so you see that as the problem, and you end up saying, okay, if that's the problem, then here's my solution. Clearly, money would be the solution, which leads me to a sense of, okay, this is what flourishing looks like. All is well when the bank account looks this way and the car is that year old or not that year old, and the kids got the right school, pedigree and everything. And you could maybe say there's all kinds of ways where we misidentify what the real problem is. Well, what's the real problem that is the umbrella, the overarching thing? It's separation from God. Separation from God. And so why do we have this identity problem? We are separated from God. The thing that we need most is his presence, and he saw fit to make that happen for us and fully restore us through Jesus. And so we say, wait, okay, if Jesus is the solution to my biggest issues, my gaping hole, my need for the presence of God, then I should probably listen to him too. He probably might know what he's talking about. Like if I'm going to trust him for like salvation and stuff, I should probably trust him for, how to live my life. And all of a sudden he started to realize, wait, he's teaching about money a lot. And he seems to be telling me over and over again that money's not what I think it is. If I trust him, I'm going to have to trust him on that too. Mm-hmm. And so I think if I was going to preach the gospel with somebody or speak with them about it, I might ask them about, what do you think is what's the root of all of this? Why do you and I both feel like we're scrambling all the time? Tell me your story about this feeling that you walk around with all the time, and where do you think it comes from? And then maybe have the opportunity to share my story, where I think it actually comes from, and where I think the story leads us, where I think the end point of the story is, that ultimately it ends with a loving God who has held us fast in his hands and is intending to restore us, and we don't need to scramble anymore.
So what about you guys? What are the lies that you've heard or you even currently hear? And tell me how the gospel speaks to those lies in your own mind or in the conversations you've had with others.
Everybody's looking over here.
Yeah, I already talked about lies.
It's your turn.
All right. Yeah. Well, I think for me, it as you've been talking, I've been like, okay, how do I narrow it down to just one lie?
Yeah.
I think it centers around it's kind of like a cousin of value or an offshoot of value. It's like, am I enough? Am I enough to be accepted by this group of people, or
That's a good word.
do I fit here? And the thing about asking yourself that question and then believing that you're not enough is that enough is a bottomless pit. You can chase enough all day long and not be enough.
It's a God you can never appease, right?
Right. And so even as you were kind of giving some examples, like buying the right thing or providing for enough of this or enough of that, like I get like even anxious as you were talking about it, because I'm like, because it's been so real for a lot of my life, where I've been like, I'm not enough. And even as I've gone through life and had different experiences, I get to this place and I'm like, well, I didn't get here on purpose. So does that make me enough even right now and here? Or can I convince you that I'm enough if I have this thing, or my car looks a certain way, or whatever? So I would say the enough lie has been a significant one. It is a significant one in general, but it's been significant in my life. And I think the gospel speaks to that because, the answer is you're never going to be enough, right? You're never going to be able to earn your way back to God. He's done all the work to make me enough. And he does, over and over again. And so he, in the midst of that, speaks the truth of what he has done and his great love for me to convince me that being his son is enough.
I don't know if this is
Excuse me.
a lie. I'll describe what's on my mind, and you can tell me how to categorize it. But the mistake I think people make if they become a Christian or within the Christian life is that the value and the purpose and the significance that God gives will make you feel valuable and significant and purposeful in the eyes of the world. Like the mistake or the lie is that the value you get from God, the significance you get from him, the identity you get from Christ will make you feel in this world, in the eyes of others, valuable. And that's not true.
Right.
I think the Christian life is an ability to live with two things. One, where my value is eternally with God, and this unfortunate, really almost sad reality that in this lifetime, in the eyes of the world, and how I view myself with the standards of this world will be lacking. We think that somehow God's going to get rid of this one, and it doesn't.
Yeah, and in the eyes of the world, some of the ways that we treat money, the ways we live our lives as followers of Jesus are even considered foolish.
Yeah. I would say you're potentially serving the wrong God if, by the standards of this world, you feel valuable and significant and powerful.
Right.
That's a dangerous place to be, as if the world, look, it's a big problem we have with, what do you call them, like popular Christian figures. They have found a way to actually be favorable and valuable in the eyes of the world. And that seems like a good thing. But if you're getting your significance from it, you're missing it. The sad truth is that a Christian life of value and significance doesn't save you from the feelings that you had that may have driven you to Christianity in the first place, that may have driven you to Christ. Those things don't really get fixed in this lifetime. If you've got them fixed, you might have a problem.
This is probably a good spot to begin to transition to talking about generosity. Folks, as you're going through the Rooted study, you'll notice during the week 8 content, there's some very, very practical tips in there. And you definitely want to pay attention to those things. It's really good information that's in the study. But don't let the dialogue begin and end just there, either with the community that you're traveling through this study with, or maybe even more importantly, the posture of your heart before the Lord. Because as you're hearing from the teaching team here, there is far more behind this issue of money and wealth and abundance and mammon than just these tips and tricks. The motivations behind it deeply inform how you actually leverage the practical nature of the Rooted study. So I want to encourage you to keep that in mind. So we've talked about mammon, we've talked about lies, we've talked about counterfeit gospel. Now let's talk about generosity. We've already established that this issue isn't just about money specifically, it's really about a posture of our hearts, our identity, a worldview that flows out of this, and then how you actually live out the course of your life. So keeping that much broader and deeper context in mind, how would you define generosity? It's not just, I'm going to give somebody some money. It's a far broader, far deeper issue. And I would say our responsibility as people who are in Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how would throw some words at generosity? How might you define it?
Mm-hmm. I think I might define it as God's vision for human flourishing. Like, I have to recalibrate over and over again, like, what I think the good life really looks like. And often the mission creep here is I'm being told all the time that the good life looks like what I'm receiving. The counter voice to that is, I think, the voice of God saying, no, the good life looks like what you're giving away. What is it that you're giving so that you're coming into alignment with what I always intended for you to be, living in a community like I always dreamed you would live in a community, and obeying, me in close relationship with me like I always dreamed we would have. Mm-hmm. And that is what flourishing looks like. It's this obedient responsiveness to God's vision for my life. Mm-hmm. And I have to remember over and over that it's a real reversal of what is being sold to me as human flourishing. Mm-hmm. What I collect is not flourishing. What I am blessed to be able to give away is a far cry closer to flourishing.
Mm-hmm. It's just you're restating Proverbs 11. A generous man will prosper.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you could do a lot sticking around Proverbs. There's another proverb that says, Lord, give me enough that I don't have to steal, but don't give me so much that I forget about you.
Yeah.
And, I could see it in my own life, our own normal tendencies to say, like, oh, I'm not redlining right now. There's no fire to put out. And so my spiritual life wanes.
Yeah.
I can see it culturally in the United States as abundance has, continued to escalate. There is a forgetfulness that comes right along with it. I could even say that you could see it sociologically. I don't want to put anybody in a particular box or put them in like a narrow definition, but I would say, for instance, you could see people in Cambodia I know and love, very, very receptive to the truth of the gospel when financially insecure. But the second largest Cambodian city in the world is Long Beach, California. And all of a sudden, the receptivity to the gospel wanes because their understanding of their plight while financially insecure was much more immediate. And then they made it to California. Everyone's dream, making it to California, get out west, right? And they made it and they thought, okay, well, I guess I don't really have those needs I thought I had before. I don't think I answered your question anymore. I think I just started talking.
I've got three answers to it, so maybe I can
keep going.
Yeah. I think three things when I think of generosity. The first one is that biblical generosity, the generosity of God, Christian generosity is eye-popping. Like, we think of generosity as charity, the portion that we give. Biblical generosity is like eye-popping giving. It's like what is that? Because God is, this is the word good. You might know this a little better than I. You normally do. The good has two interpretations. When the Bible says that God is good, it can easily mean God is generous. There's a dual meaning there. Oftentimes, that's the case. And when we think about generosity from God's point of view, and the ultimate generosity with regard to his son involved a cross. It involved a sacrifice. So generosity, you have to talk about, like, how much do we have to give to be generous.
Yeah.
You know, there's an Old Testament biblical model that says you give 10%. Well, for most people, giving 10% would be sacrificial. It's really a low bar in the Bible. It's Old Testament. It's like to me, it's like, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt give 10%. Those are like the low bars. They absolutely don't murder, we shouldn't steal, and we obviously give 10%.
Yeah.
But then we would go beyond that. Jesus calls us much higher than that. Craig Gershell says, using the statistic that most church-going Christian people give about, the average is like 2.5%. They don't give 10, they give 2.5%. And Craig's teaching is, I'm not trying to get people to 3 and 4 and 5, ideally. I'm trying to get people to think about what they're doing with the other 97.5. Because we tend to give and then go, that's God's and this is mine. And generosity says, no, your giving should be sacrificial. So 10%, if going to 10% impacts your lifestyle, impacts the way you live, then it's good. For someone who's given 10%, you would go more. It's a sacrificial generosity.
Yeah.
Let's hold on to that question of how much and the sacrificial nature of generosity. We're going to take a really quick break, and then we'll be right back.
Okay.
So, Mike, you had posed the question of how much, and right after that, you really talked about the sacrificial nature of generosity. And what came to mind is oftentimes when we think about generosity, we're thinking about people who are kind of far away from us. Maybe they're in a different context, different country, different economic strata, however you think about it. But generosity isn't something that necessarily has to leave here and go over there, though there's plenty of opportunities for generosity there. What about our neighbor, the person literally, physically right next to us, whether it's where you work, where you play, where you live? How do you practice generosity? And my mind always goes to, how do you practice generosity with that person that doesn't quite take out their trash on time, or they've got that sign in their yard, or you know what, they talk a lot, and I'd really just like to cut my grass. I'm trying to make it super practical, the stuff that we encounter on an everyday basis. But a lot of these people that I believe God has appointed us to reach, we're there on purpose, and not everybody around us knows our God. So how do we practice his generosity and bring about the flourishing that Adam talked about, this glimpse of the kingdom that could be and that we could have together? How do you actually do that? What's it look like in your life?
Well, I think we need to hear from Justin on this one. He's really good.
I was just going to say, all of those things that you said aren't warnings to your new neighbors that you like to cut your grass.
This is purely hypothetical.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this would be a good thing. I'd love to know how you have experienced generosity. You can put that in the comments. We'd love to hear those little things, those very practical things that maybe were big deals to you, but would have been small generosity from somebody else. Those are always fun to hear. What was your question?
I want to hear about your neighborhood.
Right.
My neighborhood.
Yes,
I want to hear
please.
about your problems with your neighbors.
Problems with my neighbors. Yeah, I think one of the things about generosity, particularly with your neighbors, is if you allow yourself to stop thinking of your stuff as just your own, it'll free you up to be a lot more generous with your neighbors. Also, you have to be okay with the fact that you have need. So, for example, I live in a neighborhood that has a lot of trees, and so it's like everybody owns their mini lawn care company. We've got enough gear, and my backpack leaf blower died. Yeah, and that was going to be problematic for me.
It's a dark day.
It is a dark day, right? First world problems for sure.
You are no longer self-sufficient.
That's right.
That's a tough one.
Yeah. And so what my next door neighbor did was he had been using my leaf blower. So he bought one and said, don't buy one for yourself. We're going to share this.
Oh.
That takes a great deal of commitment on my part to not go buy one.
Yeah.
And, but what it has done for me is it takes the urgency, the tyranny of the urgent, you know that phrase, of having to get things done at a certain time, it takes that out of the mix too. Like I can just be more present with my family and be okay with leaves on my ground because he's using our leaf blower.
Yeah.
And so I think my neighborhood in particular really has this because my next door neighbor, who I share a leaf blower with, when we moved in, pulled me aside and said, if you live on this street, you're going to be a part of this street. And for him, that's what this means, is that my stuff is your stuff, and we all have expertise, but we all have need. And we're just going to be okay with that and be okay in each other's space, providing for one another's need.
I think in a lot of ways, you just gave us two more definitions of generosity.
Yes.
One is neighborliness.
Yeah.
And I think if you were to look for a worldview that has the firmest foundation for neighborliness, I think it would be Christianity.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting about that is it is actually the context for essentially all of Jesus's teachings. Because these people didn't know anyone that wasn't their neighbor in a lot of ways. And then, of course, beyond that, Jesus says, and also that person that you want to put an asterisk next to, that person's also your neighbor. So to bring it close to home rather than just far away, well, Jesus handles both. And he tells us stories. He says, if your neighbor knocks on your door after midnight because they have got a guest, you're going to have to get out of bed.
Right.
You know, there's a neighborliness that has to come with reflecting my goodness to you as you reflect that goodness on to other people. So I would say neighborliness, but also maybe what you were pointing to is just generosity is right understanding. You said it means understanding that not everything, this is not my stuff. And the whole context for God bringing the people of Israel along and then forming a new nation with the Christian church is he's saying to them, what you have is what I gave you. I gave you this land. Ultimately, it's mine, but you're using it so that you can bless others. What does he say to Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis? You're blessed to be a blessing, essentially, is how Pastor Jim Sapé used to say it. So we start to then realize, okay, everything that I've got is really just an opportunity to be a good neighbor. Everything is like, I got this old bike and my kids outgrew it.
Right.
Yeah, there's a neighbor around here somewhere, right? You know, everything becomes just a raw material that we cultivate for the good of others and for the glory of God. We make it grow into generosity instead of it just being something that's collecting dust or distracting me from, the God of the universe. Now it becomes just a raw material that I can use to leverage to bless others. So what's a real practical thing? Maybe take inventory and then just say like, okay, who can I bless with this thing? I got some fish and some loaves.
Yeah.
Well, who can I bless with it? It might be maybe a practical place to start. What do I have that I can
That's
give?
The owner-manager concept out of this week's study.
Generosity, we're coming up with all these definitions of generosity. Generosity is one of those transformative initiatives that we've talked about at Vista. Jesus never says simply, here's what's wrong, here's what's right. He always gives us some way of making that journey. And in most cases, it's the journey toward maturity or the journey away from a bad cycle or a journey to separate ourselves from sin. In this case, love of value and purpose and money that the world gives. How do we break away from greed? And he says, be generous. So it's a mechanic. It's a mechanic that something you actually do. And then the question is, what is it? Then what does it look like? Well, the more generous you are, the more you're breaking that cycle, the more you're turning your heart toward God, you're trusting him. Another definition of generosity is to level the playing field. I know it sounds a little bit like socialism, but someone else is hurting, someone else is low, someone else is impoverished. I am up, I have means, I have whatever. I have to hurt, I have to Generosity is going to hurt a little bit. There's going to be a cross involved. There's going to be a sacrifice. It's going to make me vulnerable, actual generosity. Just standard giving doesn't make you vulnerable.
Yeah.
Doesn't make you, it's not a sacrifice. Some people give more than 100 other people, but it's not a sacrifice.
Right.
That's not going to change your heart. The generosity that Jesus puts in place to change your heart is one that makes you vulnerable. It makes you hurt. It changes your lifestyle. It causes, it might even make you feel less significant, less value. But what you're doing on the other side is loving. You're giving someone else value. You're making them, you're stopping their hurt. That's true generosity. It's a mechanic for breaking the cycle of greed. It's a mechanic for softening your heart.
Yeah.
It's a mechanic for leveling the playing field. The neighborly thing, the best neighborhood. He invited you in and said, we're all the same here.
Right.
And we do that by like sharing. It makes us feel less self-sufficient, which again makes us feel valuable. To have to share something, it's just like, yeah, but then I can't do it when I want to do it.
Right.
And I can't have the one I want. I don't like the electric one. I want the gas one, But it's a mechanic. It also ends up being a sign of maturity. That your heart is changing, that you are trusting God, that you have been deepened by your faith, that you're willing to be generous.
Yeah, we've used the phrase in conversation recently that, what is it that Christ did for us other than make himself vulnerable so that we can be safe? And what do? We respond in kind. We make ourselves vulnerable so other people can be safe. And reaching that maturity, that sense of the fruits of the Spirit, I think that maybe that's the most remarkable and exciting idea going on in the early portion of Acts is, well, look at all these people making themselves vulnerable so other people can be safe. You have, a church in Jerusalem that is so often selling their land so that they can take care of the poor among them, that becomes like their DNA. And I think, yes, there is real spiritual maturity attached to it. That's right.
It's interesting. You brought up socialism as a, lest you compare it to this.
Yeah, right.
What's interesting is one of the things about the kingdom, and I'll use the word shalom because it's the encapsulating word of that. Kingdom is a mutually flourishing relationship. It's not a haves and have-nots. In a socialistic system, whatever flavor it takes, there is an economy where something is taken from some and given to others by a third party, a governance structure. That's not what our God does to us. He doesn't take from us for the sake of others. There's a mutual flourishing that happens because of the oneness that comes from being in the kingdom. That's what triggered that thought in my mind. But as I was listening to you talk about tangible examples, and I love the example that you just brought up, Justin, about the beauty of actually being a good neighbor by allowing your neighbor to be a good neighbor to you. And so you mutually participate in the goodness of neighborliness, I like that word. There's just so much to unpack there. I mean, you rejected a very natural desire to establish your own security with your own resources, which is a way of worshiping mammon.
Security is just like power and control. We talked about that.
Instead, you submitted that, trusted God, and allowed your neighbor to be a neighbor to you. That's a beautiful picture of something that's just so
Simple.
profound. But time is a resource, right? And I have found in my life it's easier to skip something that I'll get to in a minute and go right to, I'm going to tangibly fix this whatever. What I'm realizing in my own life, the conviction I'm hearing from the Holy Spirit is I want you to take some of your time and actually pray for your neighbors. And what I'm learning out of this process is as I pray for my neighbors, I'm noticing I pray a little less about me. And I didn't even realize how often I come to God and it's about me. And in the process of praying for others, I'm realizing you're exercising a form of generosity in that space. And I'm actually beginning to experience the freedom of giving that time, that resource for the sake of others. and it brings glory to God in that space. And I know it will lead to those tangible things as well, because now my eyes are a little more open. My heart's a little more open. And so there's something where we know prayer is so important, but we don't, I don't know what it is. It's just something that we don't always engage with first. We don't end with that, but we know it's important. And so I just wanted to get your reaction about if someone's struggling with how to be generous, how might you pray for your neighbor? How might you engage that space with a generous heart?
I think you said it in a lot of ways, but I just think that's a really powerful point. Like we were talking earlier about Justin saying, like, there's a realization that what I have is not my own. Well, that extends to time as well. And maybe that extends to my voice. I've heard Mike talk about being generous with his words, and that's really impactful to me. So I start to really think holistically and expansively about just how generous God has been to me. And I think about, okay, he's given, time and a voice, and and I start to think, okay, how can I use those things? And maybe the most beautiful thing he's given to me is access to his throne room. Yeah. Maybe the most beautiful thing, the most, even we might say powerful thing that I have is actually a relationship with him where I can speak to him. And some of the most beautiful moments in Scripture are where someone used their voice to God on behalf of someone else. Genesis chapter 18, Sodom and Gomorrah are messed up places, and yet Abraham uses his voice to say, but what if there's only 10 righteous people there? And isn't that incredibly generous in that moment? So I think that's kind of what prayer is, using our voice in the most generous ways possible, entering the throne room of God on behalf of somebody else. And that mirrors Jesus pretty well, because I've heard someone say that he's our intercessor, that he intercedes for us. I think that's in the Bible somewhere.
It is, for sure. We did a generosity series a couple years ago, and this wonderful lady, it hit her just in a unique way. And she had also just gotten an inheritance from a relative, I think it was her father, that passed away. And she spent, I think it was the better part of a year, giving away as much as she could. And she didn't keep track of it like specifically, but she discovered in the end of a year, she had given away an entire year's salary of her own salary, whatever her salary, she had given that away. The reason I'm thinking about it is I keep that letter close by, because she said the most meaningful part of the whole exercise for her was that it taught her how to have a conversation with God. When she decided to give generously, she ran into the same problem everybody runs into, which is, where do I give and how much do I give? Right. To whom do I give? And she said, it forced me to pray about every need that I saw. And I didn't give to every need. I didn't give the same to every need. Yeah. But she said, what has stuck with me since that time, even whether I give or I don't give, is not the issue. It's the conversation that I have with God about what to do with my stuff, which goes back to the Grishel teaching, which is, and Jesus' teaching, who says it's no longer about 10%. I want all of it, which incidentally doesn't mean cash everything, liquidate everything today and give it all today, and now you're a hermit. It just means considering everything that you have. Like Grishel says, it's not just about that percentage that you give. How are you using all of your money? Right. How are you doing it? Work with God on it. How are you using it? That is, you want an enlightening experience. Pretend all your money is what it is, God's, and use it accordingly, and everything's going to be a lot different. It's a big mirror, too.
Justin, did you have anything you wanted to add before we wrap this up?
No.
Like always, tip of the iceberg is how it feels to me. But
yeah, we didn't even cover like 25% of all of our
I know,
notes.
we never do. But hopefully this gets you started. But Mike, I'm going to give it back to you just to close this out. And
okay. Yeah. I should have said that little story about
that would have been a great close.
I'll just read her last paragraph. When I don't give, when I pass someone up, I'm still called into conversation with God about it. We examine it together. Is it because I'm tapped out from the guy who was here yesterday? Or is it because I'm judging or not wanting to take the time or something else? Do I still look the person in the eye and say hello, treating him or her as deserved with a smile? You know, that is the best thing about regular giving, the ability to be generous in other ways. The smile or simple acknowledgement I would never have had the guts to do before. But she's saying because I give, now whatever I give feels okay to me.
Yeah.
It's really, she learned so much of this. Sometimes people get all gnarly about what homeless do with the money. You know, do they drink it? Do they use whatever? She says, I say to myself now that those people are on my payroll and their job for 10 minutes a day is to make me a better person.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing? They make me examine myself and talk to God about it. That is worth hard, cold cash. The whole thing is a heart issue.
Yeah.
The whole thing is a heart issue. Where is our heart? Who do we trust? And money steals our devotion, our commitment to value and significance and power. And Jesus says there's really only one way to break it. You got to be vulnerable and trust me. And that means being generous beyond what you would normally do. It's the only way to break it. And you got to keep remembering the first thing we talked about. We're blind to the powerful, overpowering impact of money and possessions and greed in our life. It is probably killing us in ways we don't know. The only way out is to start giving away and trusting God.
So we end up.
You shouldn't doubt that.
You think that's right?
That's a good one.
We say like, we think money, ultimately sort of say money is the ends, it's the goal.
Yeah.
But rather money is only ever a means.
It's just a tool.
For us. It should only be a means to bless others. And when we think of money as an ends, what we do is we treat God as a means when he is supposed to be the ends. We say, okay, I'm going to do the Christian thing because that way I get that money part. You know? But I don't know if I could say it succinctly. And there might be something off about it.
So this is a topic that's worthy of many words.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't feel insecure about that at all.